would also like to start the discussion about the Helm charts thing. I think Sean's working on Helm charts. Just to know a little bit how it is going.
I finally created a Kubernetes cluster today. Well, I had one running locally, but it made my laptop using Minikube, but it was so slow that I literally couldn't do anything. So then I tried to create one in GCP, but then we were out of networks, addresses in the network. So I created a new network, but then that one failed because we were out of IPs in that region. So now I created a new one in my newly created network in a different region, and I have it, but I'm just having an issue deploying right now, which is probably because I've missed something else from the docs and all that. So I'm almost at the point where I can start testing out what I've done. So nice. There's not really a lot to show there.
No problem.
Just for transparency's sake, I'm trying to figure out whether I can create a GCP project for the team so that we don't have to deal with this sharing problems in the future.
Maybe Sean can share his.
Yeah, well, it's just the network. There's a bunch of. If you create a new cluster using my network and you don't create it in the default region, zone, whatever GCP calls them, it will work. It's just that it takes a long time to fail, so it's hard to know if it's working or not. So yeah. But a project would be great. Yeah, the GitLab internal one is pretty messy.
Maybe consider using test ground. That one has plenty of availability, and I'm able to spin up clusters just finding that particular project.
Where
Test ground is the project I created for a distribution back in the day, and I abused my permissions to add delivery as well. So I'm trying to split that off to do properly now.
Gotcha.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just following the handbook, so.
So as well, I see that you have the first item in the demo. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I've been showing the profilers updates and during these calls. It's just a quick link actually. People, I think everyone in this on this call may be able to see the profilers, hopefully. But we already have an issue to improve visibility on that, which is Greg is also working on, which is creating a group for all developers to have access to these profilers. So that's the first one that we release in production, Workforce Web, and we plan to move on for other nodes, API as well, and other Go services.
I think as well, having this on the Pages service will be really interesting, because in the past when we've thrown anything at Pages, it's not handled it particularly well, which is a bit strange considering it's just, basically static pages. So it'll be really interesting to put it on that as well.
What do you think on moving to Gitly after Workhorse? Would be reasonable?
Yeah, Gitly is a much more critical part of our infrastructure, and yeah, so that'll be amazing. And also the Gitly team will be, speaking on their behalf, but I think they would be really happy with this as well. If they could get access.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, it'd be interesting just to, and this is kind of not exactly what we're doing here, but it'd be interesting to take, like, I mentioned it last week, maybe I should try and do it, but this new backend round tripper func, or func 2, whatever it is, and try and see what's going on there. And if we can, because I'm sure we can optimize that out. And like, it'll be quite nice because then we have our first benefit from doing this.
Yeah, exactly. I created an issue already, actually.
Oh, did you?
That, and I saw where it's coming from, but I'm not exactly sure if it's malfunctioning or something related. Let me link the issue. Just a second.
Cool.
There we go. Oops, sorry.
Thanks, Rob.
That's not the issue. There we go. I'm not sure if this connection's not being like persisted and it's running more than once.
Yeah, it's probably like what I suspect is happening is that every time the code needs to talk to the GitLab Rails application, I suspect it's probably creating a new one of these where generally with round trip is you just create one and you kind of just
reuse that connection,
yeah.
right? Yeah, that was my train of thought as well.
Yeah, yeah, we should take a look through this. This is super interesting. How are we gonna? Okay, so we're just waiting for everyone to get access to it. But what plan are we gonna use to encourage people to use this? And which teams should we go to first?
Yeah, good point. Maybe we should ping directly the teams that own the service. So maybe for instance, Kitly, we just go to their channel, update the documentation, and make at least people aware that we have this data. So fall back to that if anything goes wrong. Good place to have a look.
Is there something we can put in the service catalog? I'm just thinking out loud now.
As a link, you say?
Yeah, like so. The problem is, yeah. So we could say, you know, workhorse dynamic profiling or something. And
yeah,
then just a link to this, and then we can stick it into the Slack line. You know,
I think that would be interesting. Let me just add a point here.
Not that I think there's about 3 people that use the links in Slack line.
I
do,
it.
so yeah. And then just
I think we should probably start with people who are most likely to use these services. So people like Stan, Heinrich, Tong, like they are frequent people who are frequently doing these things. So start by giving the tool directly to people who are using it, and then let's start not a communications plan, but sharing.
I think
once engineering we can review. That's the name I was looking for.
I think once we have the access, the authorization for our developers, we could create like a demo, like 1-minute demo, how to read that graph, how to understand that. That would be very easy to follow.
And then we can add to our development documentation where we have some of these tools explained.
Awesome.
Great. So it's starting to see the light of production.
Yeah, Gitly will make a huge difference as well.
Yeah, so maybe Andrew's the next.
I think it's Andrew and Sean.
Yeah, it would be interesting to understand how was the discussion with Greg and Sean about the queues.
So I guess like what we spoke about last week was we kind of all feel like we need to reduce the number of queues. So we kind of went down this route of, well, there were also alternatives where we just use all the queues that we've got. But the alternative is we just kind of accept that we need to reduce the number of queues. And then if we do that, we'll be able to kind of get more out of Redis, you know, more out of Sidekick, reduce the CPU. And so it was really just a question of how we do that. And so I came up with this proposal, like very loose and fast proposal, admittedly, around putting the queue selectors, moving them from the Sidekick cluster into the application, so that at the application level, we we map it there. And then Sean had some concerns, particularly around migration, I think. Is that fair to say, Sean?
Yeah, I think migration is a concern no matter what we do, but we probably need to do it anyway. But migration with dynamic queue names is hard. When I say dynamic, migration with
Open.
Yeah, administrator
Configurable.
specified queue names is, yeah, configurable queue names is harder than migration with fixed queue names.
And so sort of, I guess, you know, we were all, well, a lot of us were in this call last week, and we had a lot of backwards and forwards. But where we've got to, we had a great call this morning, and where we got to with it is that we keep the queue selectors. So developers are not like hard coding queue names. And eventually the queue names will be completely removed from Sidekick. Not yet, but in some future world, there'll be no queue names in Sidekick, but we'll have the attributes. Then there will be kind of a default mapping between those attributes and a set fixed about 20 queues. And so they'll be called alpha, beta, Charlie, whatever. We actually, we don't know what they'll be called, but they'll just be 20 arbitrary keys. They could be called Q0, Q1, doesn't matter. Like, we'll figure that out. And it's really like on a default install, the configuration will be very basic. The first queue will be high urgency things. The second, and then everything else will go to the default queue. And then mailers, because they're active jobs, will just go to the mailers queue, and that'll be separate. So there'll basically be 3 queues, and the rest of them won't get any traffic. But on the Sidekick cluster side, we'll be listening to all 20 queues, and that will be like a fixed set of queues that we'll be listening to. And what that means is that on GitLab.com, we can kind of configure it. We've got 20 slots if you want, and we can sort of move things around between those slots however we want. We're not kind of constrained with having a queue called, you know, low urgency, and then, you know, in 6 months' time, we decide that we actually just want to use a different queue for each feature category. I don't think we will do that. I don't think that's a very good idea, but I'm just kind of pulling something out here. And then we would end up using like the queue that was called low urgency for feature category X. And so just having these arbitrary queue names that are meaningless, I think was the terminology that Sean used. It's much better. So we have like 20 different slots, and we can use those however we want. There's a sensible default for GitLab.com, which is, you know, as I said, urgent, not urgent. And what's quite nice with that is that it's a very nice default for people that start hitting scaling problems in self-managed instances. So when they start having problems, maybe one of the first things I want to do is separate their urgent jobs from their non-urgent jobs. And then they can do that by just listening to the 2 different queues. But also because we've got this fixed set of 20 queues, they can kind of move things around, and they'll never lose, you know, all 20 of them will always be listened to kind of via the Sidekick negate, because, you know, once you got the negate, whatever's left will be one of those queues. We know what the full set is. And so it's quite safe to let people use. It's quite easy to configure. I think it's, I mean, Sean has expressed concern about the migration. I think the migration is definitely easier than the open-ended approach. Actually, you did say that as well, Sean. What else do you want to add, Sean?
Thanks. I think we got to a good spot.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, no, I think that fixed versus configurable was probably the only thing we actually disagreed on in the end. Like everything else was sort of, and I don't think we actually disagreed on that so much. I think it was just coming from different places that made it take a while to get there. But yeah, so the idea is that the queue name is deliberately opaque, which is not great because we use the queue name for a lot of things now, but we're going to add, when we start putting things into the same queue anyway, we need to add like a worker attribute to our Prometheus metrics, because like queue alpha could be processing merge worker, and it could be processing process commit worker, and it could be processing like some other worker, and we need to know which is which anyway. So we're already going to have to like break that down by worker, and we don't need a one-to-one queue to worker mapping to enable this. So the migration itself is I think we mostly know what we think we mostly know what the traps are. It's just quite a lot of work. So yeah.
I have a question on the doc. The migration, what would that look now like to get from where we are now with 1 million queues to the fixed set that we have? Do I understand correctly that we just add the new fixed set that we think of pretty names for to our configuration, and then we start watching those on top of the 1 million queues for a worker? And then when we know that all the jobs have been processed in like one of the upcoming releases, we remove the 1 million queues and we've only got the fixed set of pretty queues left.
Yeah, when we know that all the jobs have been processed is like, I think Gabriel, or no, Dreglash actually wrote a like migration helper for this. So like there is a thing in the application that will take jobs from one queue and put them in another queue. So we can use that, but obviously we don't want to use that until we think that's pretty much empty, because like it's just going to have to walk through the entire queue. Yeah,
so the queue should be empty. Should we worry about the scheduled set like you discovered?
Yes. So for GitLab.com, we'll probably need some special handling for that, just because that set is like, what did I say, 60,000 entries or something? But for most instances, we will just have to walk through that in a migration, and we might need to leave that to a major version update. We could also add a background job to do that, I guess. But yeah, that's tricky but fixable, basically, is my feeling.
The other part of it is that as part of the migration, I think you were kind of alluding to this maybe as well, Bob, is we stop generating the all queues YAML, and we add, like you say, we add the 30 queues to the, or 20 queues to the end of that. And then over time, we basically remove the old queues so that it's just the alpha, beta, whatever,
just the,
alpha, bravo. Yeah, we could also be cute like Elastic style and give them Marvel names or something stupid like that. But anyway, yeah, and then the other part was that we take what you did with the you know, you did that little spike where you did the queue allocation on the client side. We put that in a mix-in, and so to experiment with this, we just apply that mix-in to a few queues, and like we use the slightly crappy name, smart queue worker or smart worker or something. I'm sure you could think of a better name, and it's in a mix-in. And then we kind of roll it out, say for the cron jobs first or something. And then the cron jobs as a bad example, because there's other stuff with cron jobs, but we can apply it to a few things, make sure that it works. And then eventually that mix-in will just become part of the application worker, so that everything is a smart worker, whatever you want to call it. There's a terrible name. Feels very 80s.
So the idea is that once we expect a worker to only be running on one of the new queues, is the time that we also give it the ability to run on any queue based on the configuration, based on the queue selector thing. And then, like Andrew said in one of the comments, we can remove the queue selector from the Scikit cluster side of things. So the queue selector is just used by the application itself when it's scheduling a job to pick which queue the job goes to, rather than to choose which queues to pick up.
Sean, when it's scheduling a job or it's startup? So, sorry, Bob.
Sorry, it uses it. It gets all of that at startup, but it uses the definitions when it's scheduling a job. Yes.
Yeah.
And by default, Scikit cluster would be watching star, just like the people.
In a base install, base install, it would be alpha to whatever.
Yeah.
Quebec or whatever. Or Ant-Man to.
I'm happy that there is like that you've thought about the way to migrate this, and the way you sell it to me now, I'm not scared. So I think it's a great idea.
Cool. Yeah, I think it works. I think we all agree. Does anyone have any comments?
So one thing that's not super clear right now, I think we should not really start doing much on this until we've finished what we're currently doing, right? Like, so what we're currently doing is using the queue selector on Scikit cluster everywhere. Even though we're eventually going to remove it, we want to keep doing that now and get the fleet switched over to the new style. And then from that point, we can start doing this, but we don't want to mix the two projects up, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I love that while we were doing a migration to a new style, we thought of another thing to migrate to before the first one is finished.
But it uses it's building on it, right? Because it's using the attributes, it's just moving where they are. But yeah.
So silly question. We wouldn't have been able to actually see this before. So we started rolling out changes and then we zoomed in further to understand what's happening under the hood even further. And that's why we came to this situation rather than we could have figured it out from the beginning, right?
Well, we noticed because Chris rolled out the new watch everything workers. So yeah.
So from my point of view, like when I was doing that gerrymandering and I was trying to figure out a way, like I kept sort of feeling like we've gone the wrong route here, but maybe it's kind of like a harmless kind of deviation. And it was like, well, at some stage in the future, it would be really nice to like reduce this number of queues down. But I don't think I was aware of the cost of that. And you know, it happened to work pretty well for quite a long time because we could, you know, we always had all the queues separate. So it was a great way of being able to kind of divert traffic away. But then particularly last Thursday, when Craig did that and we realized like how much we're consuming, that was kind of the moment at which is like, okay, this thing that is kind of like technical debt and doesn't feel good, we actually have to get rid of it. That's my sort of feel on it.
So this is then seems another example of working like iteratively, but properly iteratively, meaning roll something out as soon as you have a chance to do it, so that you can get the data that will feed your decisions further. Because I'm not saying we did anything wrong here, by the way. Like the project we are currently running is already complex enough without the new one. But let's say theoretically, if we could have rolled out at least one partial queue, sorry, I think I'm getting corona. Like if we could have rolled out one partial queue earlier, we would have been able to reduce some of the work that we've done.
So the one thing I'll say, Marin, is like I think the path, even if we'd done that, like the selector stuff, like I don't think we're throwing away a lot of code. You know, it's pretty much and the way that the queues will end up in the same piles, it's kind of the same stuff. Yeah.
The code that we're throwing away is basically the stuff behind the experimental queue selector flag in Scikit cluster. So like we don't expect people to use that like for without paying careful attention to it.
And we probably will keep some of that stuff to do the calculation on the other side anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
We will. We will. We are using the queue selectors for that.
And then the only other thing we're getting rid of is the generating of the YAML files, which is kind of like a, you know, that's not much code.
and the queue selector stuff that we've worked on for inside the chef repo, but we were going to get rid of that anyway because by then we'll probably be on Kubernetes.
Yeah,
and that was, and to be fair, that was done during the gerrymandering as just a tool to like help me understand like all the complexity there. So that's pretty old.
Yeah, any queue configuration gets much simpler anyway because like you only have to name like a couple of queues rather than like 100 queues. So yeah.
But Marin, I think my point is that the biggest cost is actually in the documentation, which we, you know, the experimental queue selector documentation, but really the functionality and our understanding, we're just building on that. We're not kind of like changing direction. We're just kind of going further on that road.
How do we, thanks for explaining. I was not even trying to say that we did something wrong, just to be absolutely 100% clear.
Yeah.
Just trying to like understand whether there has, if you already worked with me, you know that I like taking shortcuts and I like taking, like parallelizing work as much as possible. So what I'm trying to figure out is whether we had a branching and the moment where we could have taken a different route sooner rather than 2 months into the project.
If we decided to do this up front, we wouldn't have known that we would have had this issue. So we would be sort of defending against something that we didn't know we had, and we'd also be reducing, well, we wouldn't be reducing our flexibility, but it would have taken us longer to build the flexibility that we have with the queue selector the way it is now. And we wouldn't have known about the issue ever, like, you know, but we'd have had to do more work to get to the point where we never found this issue.
And like, if I was to take one thing that I kind of looking back and I'm a bit irritated at myself with, is when we were taking so previously we had GitLab Monitor doing all the monitoring on Sidekick. And because it's just a thing that queries Redis, it like didn't really understand what the hell was going on there. And obviously we moved that into the application. And when I did that, I had the choice of either using queues or worker classes. And I went with queues as the attribute that we kind of key these things by, even though I was vaguely aware that, you know, there was a limited lifespan on every worker having a queue. And so maybe like if there was one learning, it would be that we should have put the worker class onto the attributes right from the beginning and onto all the logging. I think we got it on all the logging, so that's not a problem. But certainly on the monitoring, we've only got queues, and because there's going to be multiple workers writing to a single queue, that's going to, you know, be thrown away. So we have to get rid of that, and that was a mistake. I don't think it's a major mistake. I don't think it's like a huge amount of work to fix.
That's easily fixable before we like we can fix that basically now, right before we even start on this project. And then by the time we do the project, we're done.
Alerts that are going to be a bit of a pain to fix, because we obviously lose all of the history on those, right? When you add the new attributes,
But we could just run with workers there and then switch over once we have history for the workers that we've just not been using, but then we'd need extra recording rules and whatnot. So maybe that's not super necessary.
Well, I would quite like to get those the workers like as soon as possible, just for exactly that reason, so that we've got like a few weeks worth of history on that.
Yeah, I think it's in the ready column.
Yeah,
I think Bob or I put it there, but I've been fighting with Helm charts.
My next question would be, what can we do? Are there any suggestions on what we can do to move all this knowledge that now four of you have accumulated over the period of this project? Because it would be a terrible situation for us to move on to the next one before we are able to share our learnings with the whole development team and explain why this is important to them.
So my first thing on that is I think that the reliability teams are almost more important on that respect, like being able to, you know, carve off a new Sidekick, for example, and, you know, create if someone from a development team does pretty much what Dylan Griffith has done recently, you know, hey, we've got these new queues, we need, like, it shouldn't be on scalability. It would actually be like an anti-pattern if we had to go and handle that. So I think it's really important that this knowledge is also passed on to the reliability teams. And I think the best way to do that is for them to just actually pick something up and do it. And I don't know.
That's not good enough, Andrew, mostly because that would mean that we have to expect from reliability teams to fully understand how the application functions, which I don't think it's currently the case. which means we would have to go one level deeper to teach, which we don't have the time to do. But there is something that you're saying there, which I think is really important, and that is we probably don't want to focus exclusively on the impact from the development side. We want to focus on the overall picture, both from infrastructure and development side, because if I understand correctly where some of the disagreements or debate rather was between you and Sean was your two different points of views towards the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So how can we get those two things together so that we can show the same picture to everyone?
I think for developers, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sean, go ahead.
For developers, I think for both sides, it actually gets easier, but maybe that's just me like putting too good a gloss on it. But for developers, I think we have already been sort of communicating that you need to think about the attributes that your worker has, and you still need to think about that. You just, from a development side, I think it almost is just as easy as it is now, like in the sense that you can define what the workload for your worker is, and you can define like what the resource boundary is. And we already have like documentation on that, so like we can improve that. But I think the key thing is that we are just moving away from a one queue per worker model, which I don't think most people have thought much about anyway. So hopefully for them, there's no real big change. Like the point is still, you are still adding these attributes to your workers to indicate to the infrastructure teams where it should be run, et cetera, et cetera. It's just the mechanics of how that works has changed.
Would be interesting to have a better visibility, like if me as a developer add a new worker with some attributes, where can I see the impact of this worker? Where exactly I should have a look on that? Maybe the documentation a little bit better on this direction would be interesting.
I think that the dashboards that we currently have that watch a single queue will just use the new attribute that we're going to add to our metrics that is called worker, but for the rest, that should stay the same. And we've already made the way we created those million queues transparent just by including application worker. Will be like, from now on, they're going to be including the smart worker, and that's going to pick a queue. And from that side, development doesn't really need to do anything.
So I have, exactly. I think from the development side, it makes things a lot easier because you just got to get your attributes right. And then, we'll take care of it. I think the 2 points I wanted to make are, one, there's a third stakeholder that I think we should engage with fairly early on. And that's the QA team responsible for the reference architectures, because I think it would be really cool if they could, for the 25K reference, or whichever one that starts making sense, actually splitting things out so that we have, urgent, non-urgent, or CPU bound, or whatever. Because certainly, at 50K, I can imagine that would make a big difference to their world. I mean, I don't know quite how busy 50K reference architecture is, but at least give them that possibility. And then the other thing is kind of maybe related to that is really beef up the documentation around this, because at the moment it's a bit of a hodgepodge, and maybe engage with the technical writing teams to make this into a first class scaling feature, and then encourage people to use it and say this is something, if you're seeing these problems with your queues or whatever, this is a possibility.
So that is, from my side, that is somewhere further down the line. What I'm trying to suggest here is you've all done a lot of work to understand how all of this actually works, both from infra and development side. And I would like to be able to offer up that knowledge in a format that is not, here is 5-page document that you need to understand, I don't know even how. More I'm looking for a how-to, or I'm looking on, not even a how-to. It is, why is scalability taking 2 months to get this thing done? Is the question I would like to answer.
Right, I see. So like, this is what we've done. This is why we've done it this way. This is what we're doing next. That sort of thing is what you want to
Yes.
see. Yeah, I don't
and
think
then
we
share
have
it
anything like that.
with wider audience so that we can explain to everyone what kind of challenges the application actually has when it comes to scaling, so that we can engage with development and infra and quality. Sure, no problem, to explain why this is really important and why we've been doing it. Because this is really hard to explain, right? Like it's nearly impossible to go to higher levels and explain why we've been doing the work we've been doing, apart from saying we're going to utilize things better. Okay.
It sounds like
Great.
there'll probably be a couple of audiences for something like that. You're talking to the developers who are impacted by it. You're talking to infrastructure who's going to end up using it. You're potentially talking to customers who are going to have to understand how to use this, but you're also talking to the executives in the sense of, as you say, like justifying why it's taken time to do a certain thing or why it's hard. But it also sounds like this might be something that happens regularly, like as we do more projects going forward, that we get into similar situations where it takes us a long time to figure out what we should actually be doing. So are you also looking for a format that's perhaps reproducible across different projects as we go forward?
Absolutely. So the executives I'm the least concerned about, because we can always give an executive summary, right? This is going to make things better because of this. This is the outcome that we are looking for. That's not the problem, but the problem is I want to make sure that the knowledge that we've accumulated has been explained to every stakeholder in a format of why is Scalability doing this, rather than this is what Scalability has done. So yes, that the answer to your question, Rachel, is yes, this will probably need to be in a format reproducible as we go through other work to scale GitLab.com, GitLab on GitLab.com.
Well, the two formats that come to mind is either a not exactly a blog post, but a write-up of what we did and why we did it and what we found, or alternatively a video version of that write-up, where it's a structured discussion that's recorded, but we don't have to go through the process of writing it down and making it read correctly. Those are the two that come to mind.
Both, most likely. I think are good at combination, because we have people consuming content differently, right? So I know this might not be interesting for all of you, but what I've learned so far working here is that communicating what and why you have actually done ends up being more important sometimes than the work that you actually achieve. Because it really makes a difference when you actually need to justify the next set of work you want to do. And I'm not saying that anyone asked me to justify any of this. I'm just saying that by over communicating, I don't have to, and you don't have to, because it makes it very simple. And then from the experience of like some database changes that we've been doing, like Yorick has been doing and so on, like the blog post format you mentioned, Rachel, ends up being super big driver for us for new traffic. So new challenges are coming from the outside as well, and like pushing us in a better direction overall. So I want to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we are this fringe team that is resolving a problem that someone else made somewhere, knowingly or unknowingly, and that we are going to do cleanups left and right. Like that's not what we are about here. We are here to set the direction for everyone and make sure that we explain like, well, this is the benefit. So I think I have one action item, and that is Rachel, you will be taking on this as something to figure out how we could do it. And then we'll work with the rest of the team to contribute to that, so we can create some exposure on why this has been done.
Sure, I'm happy to take that on.
Thanks. All right. Anyone else wants to mention anything before we continue to the next item? I see Bob has. Cool. Bob?
I'll take that as a no. So I don't really have anything to show here, but Balu brought up an interesting point. In my demo last week, I showed you all starting up a Sidekick cluster using the Sidekick configuration. And I believe it was Marin who brought it up, or Osvaldo, I don't remember, brought it up that you control the Sidekick cluster process with GitLab CTL service Sidekick cluster, while the thing that you're configuring is actually Sidekick. This means that if people try this feature out before, they were controlling Sidekick with the command GitLab CTL Sidekick do something. If they try out our new feature where we would expose Sidekick cluster by default, that would need to change to GitLab CTL Sidekick cluster do something. And then in the future, we would need to change it back because we want the service that they're controlling to be the same service that they're configuring. To avoid this change, we would need to rename the service Sidekick cluster when you've configured it through Sidekick, which is why I created that issue, and I'm going to be picking that up.
I think the main goal there is like having it being controlled by Sidekick process, being like, we don't need, the customer doesn't need to know its Sidekick cluster behind the scenes. So that was the initial idea, right? And since we are actually configuring that in Sidekick configuration on the bus, that makes even more sense to get this going on Sidekick name of CTL command. So that would be.
I need to drop off. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Yeah, maybe put that on the issue, I guess, as well, though.
Yeah,
Bob was probably your audience for that, so.
Yeah, we discussed this issue with Balu. So yeah, that's the direction there. We are going to use the Sidekick naming on the CTL command instead Sidekick cluster. It will be easier for customers. It will be easier for less overhead for everyone.
Okay, I guess that's us. Speak to you all soon. Have a good weekend. Stay safe.
Yes.
Anybody else want to wrap up the meeting?
Stay at home.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.